The Israeli military has taken significant steps in response to the devastating attack by Hamas gunmen over the weekend. They have called up an unprecedented 300,000 reservists and are imposing a complete blockade on the Gaza Strip, hinting at the possibility of a ground assault. Following intense Israeli airstrikes, Hamas, the governing movement in Gaza, announced its intention to execute an Israeli captive for each Israeli airstrike on a civilian residence without prior warning. Inside Israel, Palestinian fighters remained entrenched in various locations, 2 days after launching a raid that resulted in hundreds of Israeli casualties and the taking of numerous hostages, shaking Israel's perception of invincibility. Israeli television channels reported that the death toll from the Hamas attack had risen to 900, with over 2,600 injured. Gaza's health ministry reported at least 687 Palestinian fatalities and 3,726 injuries from Israeli airstrikes on the besieged enclave since Saturday. Among the casualties were citizens of Italy, Ukraine, and the United States, with President Joe Biden confirming at least 11 American deaths. Hamas stated that it had been adhering to Islamic principles by safeguarding Israeli captives, but issued a threat to harm civilians and broadcast it. Similarly, the Islamic Jihad armed wing, which claimed to be holding more than 30 Israelis, called on Israel to avoid targeting civilians if it cared about the fate of the Israelis in its custody. In response to Israel's intensified retaliatory strikes, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant announced a tighter blockade to prevent food and fuel from reaching Gaza's 2.3 million residents. Human Rights Watch condemned this move as collective punishment and a war crime. Israeli airstrikes became more aggressive as night fell, targeting several Hamas security facilities and ministries, leading to the destruction of roads and buildings. The Israeli bombing also impacted the headquarters of the private Palestinian telecommunication company, which could affect communication services. As explosions and lighting filled the skies amid rainy weather, the sound of bombings mixed with thunder. In a sign of Israel's readiness for war, a cabinet member from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party suggested the possibility of a national unity government, including opposition leaders, within hours. Netanyahu conveyed to mayors of southern towns affected by the surprise assault that Israel's response would have far-reaching consequences for the Middle East. The prospect of the conflict spreading to other areas raised alarm in the region, with Israeli troops dealing with infiltrations from Lebanese territory, and Hezbollah launching rockets into northern Israel in response to Israeli shelling in Lebanon. In Israel's south, where the Hamas attack occurred, the chief military spokesperson reported that troops had regained control of overrun communities, but encountered isolated clashes as some gunmen remained active. The shocking scenes of hundreds of Israelis killed, including those gunned down at an outdoor dance party and abducted from their homes, were unprecedented in the decades-old Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The activation of 300,000 reservists within 2 days fueled speculation about a possible ground assault on Gaza, a territory Israel evacuated nearly 2 decades ago. Israel issued warnings to Palestinians in specific areas of Gaza, advising them to leave, further indicating its shift towards a war footing. Hamas, which seeks Israel's destruction, cited Gaza's 16-year blockade and the recent deadly Israeli crackdown in the occupied West Bank as justifications for its attack. While mainstream Palestinian groups deplored the violence, they argued that it was foreseeable given the stagnant peace process and the rhetoric of far-right Israeli leaders discussing the annexation of Palestinian land. Israel and Western countries firmly condemned the deliberate targeting of civilians. The attackers killed numerous young Israelis at an outdoor dance party in the desert, with reports of 260 casualties at the site. Survivors emerged from hiding the following day, with the scene strewn with damaged abandoned vehicles. In Gaza, footage showed people searching for survivors amid collapsed buildings, with sirens blaring and emergency teams working to extinguish fires. Egypt and Turkey expressed readiness to mediate, while Qatar engaged in discussions with Hamas to negotiate the release of Israeli women and children held in Gaza in exchange for Palestinian women and children in Israeli prisons. The violence poses a challenge to US-backed efforts to normalize relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, potentially undermining Palestinian aspirations for self-determination and constraining Iran, a supporter of Hamas. Israel's military faces scrutiny over its intelligence failure, described as the country's worst in 50 years. Concerns about the fate of Israeli hostages could limit Netanyahu's options.